Welcome to How to Paint a Sunflower with Color Sheets. Now, my last blog, I showed you the color sheets that were sent to me by Viviva Colors. And so then I wanted to try them out on an actual painting. I swatched them for you in my last blog and told you some of the things that I found, some of the pros and cons. But now I'm going to paint an actual painting with the color sheets. Now I'm starting off wetting the petals of the sunflower, and I'm using what they call happy yellow and just dropping it in there. Now you can use it directly from the sheets I found, or you can use a palette to mix it in. So I'm wetting it with the happy yellow first, then I'm coming in with a little bit of a darker, not orange, it's really still the happy yellow, but it's just more concentrated. And then I'm going to look for another darker color because to do the shadows, but it's not in this book, so I'm going to go ahead into my other little booklet. I have two. I have the original colors and I have the spring colors. That's what they've sent me. And I'm going to go for this burnt sienna. Now, normally in traditional watercolors, this burnt sienna would be more toward a brown, but I found on the color sheets that it's kind of an orange. It's a slightly muted orange, but it's still an orange. So I thought that would make a good shadow color, a good color for the darks. And that's what I'm trying here. I really like it. I like the contrast between it and the happy yellow that they call it. And I'm just covering the petals and then coming back in and dropping in some of that burnt sienna for the darker shadows. I'm putting the happy yellow in and then just coming straight off the sheet. You can do that, or you can pick some of the color off the sheet and put it on a palette like I said before. And I'm just using a mix of techniques here. I'm using some off the sheet, some in my palette. I'm just really experimenting. Like I said, this is the first time I've had experience with these color sheets, so I wanted to show you how it went for me. Now I'm just going to speed it up because it's pretty much the same process for all of the flower petals. I'm getting a little closer here so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm doing the happy yellow, coming back in with a little bit more concentrated color, and then with a little bit of the burnt sienna, which is actually an orange for my shadows. Getting all that done. And it's basically the same technique. I'm just kind of wetting the petals, putting in the lighter yellow and working in a little bit of that burnt sienna. And I think I've also added here a touch of, they call it chrome orange. That's the mid-tone orange that you see. So, and I decided that there needed another petal. It was too fat for one petal. And I'm also using my small number 2 brush. Now, some of the things that I have found with working with these watercolors, these color sheets, is that it's very staining. So once you put the color down, you're going to have a little bit of a hard time lifting it. So it's best to work from very light to dark. That way you don't go dark too quickly, and then you can't lift it as you could like a traditional or a non-staining watercolor. So keep that in mind, that they're very staining. Another thing is once you put it on the paper, it soaks down into those fibers pretty quickly. The particles are pretty small, so they go right down into those fibers of the paper. So it's hard to blend it out because it's kind of just sucks it up right in that spot. So be really careful to help alleviate that or avoid that. Wet the paper first so that the paint will spread and it won't leave it and just leave it streaky. That's the problem, is it can come off very streaky if you're not careful with these color sheets. So to avoid that, I suggest to wet your paper first before you put the color on. That will help alleviate it, and work light to dark. Those are 2 of my best tips for these color sheets. Now, as you see, I'm just going around the sunflower, doing each petal, same technique. When I have little lines, I just either put the chrome orange that I've introduced or some of the burnt sienna. The burnt sienna is more for shadows though, just so keep that in mind. where I want it to be really dark. But overall, these colors are so saturated and so vivid. It reminds me of painting with ink. If you've ever painted with liquid inks, with those like Dr. somebody, I forgot, it starts with a P, I can't even think of them. But if you've used, liquid ink or liquid colors that are ink based or resin based, it's very similar to that in the vividness and the richness and saturation. The only difference is these will reconstitute. Inks will not. Once they're dry, they will not reconstitute. And they have a resin in them that's kind of hard and shiny once it hardens, once it dries. So now I've got the sunflower painted, putting in all my lights and darks where I wanted it. So now I've mixed up a little bit of the bark brown. They call it, I think they actually call it tree bark brown. And I'm going to put that right in the center. And I've watered it down some because I don't want it really dark yet. Like I said, best to work light to dark with these for sure. Don't try to go dark too fast, because these are not as easily blendable as traditional watercolors, and again, they stain. And I'm just adding more of the color where I want the shadows to be in this center. You know how the sunflower has a center, and then all around that center, the little stamen, the little pollinator things kind of stick out a little further than the center around, like a little ruffle. So I'm making the edges irregular and jiggity jaggedy to kind of indicate that little ruffly circle around the center. And now I'm going to paint that with some of the happy yellow, the little ruffle. I'm calling it ruffle where the pollinators are. The little not pollinators. Well, I guess that could technically be the term. But I'm just putting that there where all the little rufflies are. That's going to make the seeds. And I'm doing that really pale all around the sunflower center. Trying not to get into that brown so that they bleed, since they're both still wet. I'm being really careful. Adding a little bit more of the pigment in the bottom area. Until I'm pretty satisfied with it. It almost looks green, and I think the reason that happy yellow looks like a pale green is because I've got so much graphite on my paper, because I made the lines really dark, that it's blending with the yellow and turning it sort of a greenish color. So now I came back in with some of the burnt umber, and I mixed it with the tree bark brown to get a little bit of a more reddish, lighter brown. And I'm just dropping it into that yellow while the yellow is still wet, making sure I'm leaving some of those little areas for the yellow to peek through, for the little pollen ends of the little pollen stamen thingies. Those are the technical terms, pollen stamen thingies. So, write that down. Now, and I'm just going to keep doing that. In some areas, I'm going to make the brown a little paler, and by paler, I add just a little bit more water to the mix to get it paler. Some areas I want it a little darker, add a little bit more of that pigment to it. And I'm speeding this up because I think you get the idea. We're just going to work around the flower ruffle, drop it in that pigment while it's still pretty wet, being careful to leave a lot of yellow peeking through until we complete that. Now I'm just coming back into some of the areas where I want it to be a little darker, where there might be more shadow area, and adding some of the tree bark brown. And it's still wet, so it's blending really well. Like I said, the key to getting this type of watercolor, this color swatches to blend well, is to kind of keep it wet. It's not going to blend as well as the traditional watercolors that I've used. Or at least mine don't. Maybe I just don't know how to use them, but I'm showing you how I'm using them the best that I can. Now I'm coming in here with some lemongrass. It's a green. It's really a pale, almost yellow green. And I'm trying to decide where I want to start. Sometimes I have to just decide. So here we go. We're going to start down here, and we're going to paint this little leaf with this pale lemon. It's lemongrass, but it's a pale yellow green. And I'm just painting this directly onto the paper. I didn't wet it first. So we're doing wet on dry. Now I'm coming back in with some foliage green. It's a little bit of a darker green, more of a true green, and painting the back side of the leaf so that it's darker and letting it blend in. We're doing it while it's wet. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm getting just a little tiny touch of the Viridian green, which is a blue green, and putting that in for the shadows, and then blending it into those other greens. And it's blending really well because everything's still wet, so I really like how that blended. And it does depend on the colors I found. I think some of the pigments are, the particles of the pigments are larger in some of the colors, some are smaller, and I think the ones with the smaller pigments are harder to blend because they suck into the paper so quick. So just be mindful of that some of the colors do blend beautifully, and other ones, not so much. So you'll have to experiment if you ever get these color sheets and try to use them. But I have to say, they are really, really good for portable watercolor sketching. Perfect. I really love, I have taken them out in my yard, and I have been using them for different watercolor sketches, and they work fabulous as a portable kit. So, and I think that was the whole intention when this company got started, is to make watercolor more portable and less bulky. So again, I've put on the lemongrass, coming back in with some foliage green for some of the mid-tone areas that I want. Doing it while it's still wet. And it is blending beautifully. Coming in with a little bit more of that foliage green just to darken that up some. And in the shadows, I'm going to use a little bit of the Viridian whenever I get to the shadow part, just letting you know. But right now I'm still working with a little bit of that foliage green, and I'm just layering it in. Now I'm coming in with a little bit of actually peacock blue instead of the Viridian. I've decided to change it up a little bit. So the Viridian mixed with that foliage, back it up. The peacock blue mixed with that foliage green almost mimics the Viridian. Not quite, it's not as dark as the Viridian, but it still gives kind of the same look. Just to keep the leaves consistent, I'm going to add a little bit of peacock blue into that bottom one. So now I'm speeding it up just to show you how I did this big leaf. It has a lot of pattern on it. I'm using the peacock blue actually to paint in those little patterns. I did the lemongrass first, and I let it dry completely, or almost completely dry, before I started dropping in the patterns, because I didn't want the pattern to bleed too much. I wanted it to stay solid, more solid, so that it was more visible. And I'm adding the pattern first in this bottom leaf underneath. We're going to let that dry a little bit. Now I'm coming back in with a little bit of the foliage green and putting in the shadows on this leaf, and it kind of blends and unifies the leaf, and it makes the patterns not stand out so much, makes it a little more subtle. And you see, I really drew dark lines so that y'all could exactly see what I've done. Again, up here I already did the pattern, it's already dried, so I'm taking the foliage green and just doing a light wash over it to blend it and to soften that pattern up. Now I'm just putting some shadows in. Now this I'm doing with a little bit of the olive green some of the shadow work. I'm using the olive green swatch color sheet, and just blending that out with clear water and to separate those two leaves. I'm just giving you the overview of how I did it, so now you can see how I did the leaves. Now it's still a little wet, so I'm coming back in with more of the peacock blue right back over those patterns because it was a little too subtle. I wanted them to be a little bit more pronounced. So I went in and did those. Then I just took some ocean blue for these blue flowers, and I just painted all the little circles with some ocean blue first. And then I came back in with the peacock blue and did the outlining and some of the shadow work. While it was a little bit, I don't know if it was still, it was damp. These were not really real wet when I came back in with the peacock blue, but they weren't completely dry. So I'd say damp. Damp is a good word. And I just drew in the little lines around each little flower and used that for the shadows. And I continued to work on the blue flowers in the same way all the way around. And I just decided to add the blue just to give it a little pop of color and kind of contrast. It's a complementary color to the orange that's in the sunflower. Blue and orange are complementary colors, and when you put them together in a painting, they really make each other pop. I'm so tired of that word pop, but I can't think of another word, but they really complement each other. So now I have completed it. Let it dry completely, and I'm taking a micron pen. I'm doing some shadow work with stippling, just little tiny dots, and I'm getting in some shadows in between each petal, just darkening it up and giving it some more definition. And I'm pretty sure this is a 005 micron pen that I'm using. It's really small, really tiny. I'm going up into the pollinators areas and giving it a little bit more darkness, giving it another dimension. And I just did this randomly where I thought it would look good to have some more shadows, some deeper shadows. And then I started to outline each petal with the pen. And I worked my way around the whole painting, just doing my outline work and adding in some of the detail lines with my pen, just to do something different, to make it look a little bit more graphic. And because, you know, I get tired of doing the same thing all the time, so sometimes we just have to do something a little bit different. And for this painting, I decided to use my pen, do a little stippling and a little outline work. And I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. And there's no really pattern or rhyme or reason. I'm just doing this where I instinctually think that there should be some extra shadows. You do your painting the way that you would like to if you try this. And once it's all outlined, this is how it looks. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this.